Well, hi, everybody. Good morning. I wanted to thank everyone for being here and welcome you. We have this important discussion today. My name is George Longwell, and I'm the Vice President of Engagement at the Greater Washington Board of Trade. Today, our panel of experts will explore the commercial real estate ecosystem and what is being done to address infrastructure, workplace operations, and human experience, and the importance of coordinated public-private engagement. This is the second installment of many conversations we plan to bring to our members in the Future of Work series, and we will explore how the pandemic and other dynamics are changing how we work, and by extension, how we live, learn, and travel, and shop, and play. Not just this year, but into the future. We want to thank Crown Castle and Verizon, our series sponsors, for their support in making this event and the entire series possible. We also want to thank McKinsey and Company and APCO Worldwide as our series knowledge partners. Now I'm very pleased to welcome our terrific guest this morning. I'd like to introduce our presenter and moderator, Ben Safran, DC-based partner with McKinsey and Company. Ben, thank you very much for your support and participation. Ben will provide some background to set the stage for discussion and then facilitate a conversation with our panelists. Chris Camarra, partner at Holland and Knight, LLP. Paul Reddick, Senior Vice President of Strategy, Product, and Business Development at Crown Castle. And Evan Regan-Levine, Executive Vice President at JBG Smith. As a reminder, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A feature and we'll address them at the end of the conversation. Now I'll turn it over to Ben. Ben, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, George. Thank you for having me. Thanks to the Board of Trade and thanks to these awesome panelists. I'm really excited to be here, excited to learn from them because I think a lot of fantastic insights and innovation that's happening across all three of the folks we're going to talk to today. I'll set this stage just 5 minutes or so, sharing a bit of our research as it relates to the future of work, the future of commercial real estate. And then, obviously we'd love to spend most of the time hearing from our panelists, but a little bit of maybe nationwide research to set this stage. So first, we've done some scanning of what companies are announcing they're doing or thinking about doing, and also some surveys of employees to hear where employee preferences and sentiments are. And you can see on the left-hand side, first worth noting that 44% of Fortune 500 companies are still undecided around what their return to work model is going to be. So, I think timely to hear some insights from folks talking to tenants and whether or as occupants, what some of their thinking about. When we look at the choices that are being made, you can see that about 18% of the total are going to expect to return, more than 4 days a week. We're calling those returners. 31% a hybrid model, 2 to 3 days in the office, and 7% essentially saying, we can really shed pretty significantly our office footprint. It's interesting to contrast that on the right-hand side, though. C-suite executives believe it's going to be a mostly office-centric future. While maybe, pre-COVID, we know 92% were more than 4 days of work expectation in the office. In the future, post-COVID, the expectation is that goes down, but it goes down to 52%, and 88% of the total actually sort of office-centric, majority of the time in the office. If we take ahead, that is creating some tension or a potential disconnect on the next slide around what employers are wanting and what employees want in terms of the future model. So as mentioned on the left-hand side, 88% of executives would like their employees to be in the office 3+ days a week or expect them to be post-COVID. But when we survey employees, you really do see a strong preference for a home-centric model. 53% want to work from home 3 days a week rather than work from the office 3 days a week. And it becomes even more dramatic or significant in that nearly 30% of employees said they would consider switching employers if they were, forced to go back to a fully on-site model. And that, on the next page underscores, potential uncertainty in the future around what the talent landscape is going to look like and how commercial office space and the future of downtown might need to respond. And so if you actually look at employees that think or say they will be likely to leave their job in the next 3 to 6 months, 40% say it's somewhat likely or more or higher that they're going to consider a move in the next 3 to 6 months. And that might get further exacerbated. When we look at employees that plan to quit, they actually increasingly are saying we might not even need an offer in hand. We might actually leave without an offer. And so, we're calling it a bit of the great attrition, or so the great changing talent landscape, really a lot of uncertainty around how our places can respond to the fact that you can work from anywhere and that there's going to be a lot of mobility and disruption. And so, some thoughts, again, from our research around what companies can do and maybe how do we respond before, hearing from the panelists around what they're hearing and seeing. If we go to the next slide, I think there's an increasing recognition that the future is going to be hybrid and that we're going to need to reinvent the office, but that there is a lot of risk when it comes to a hybrid dynamic. Risk around what happens if too few return, what happens for those that stay at home, potentially feeling left out. How do we change our operating model? And so then, next slide, maybe just a couple of parting thoughts around what good might look like and how to create, potentially those dynamic moments. I think, 4 areas we see a lot of innovation from companies. First, around productivity, how to embrace some of that automation and digitization that's happening, how to rethink your organization or operating model. Talent, maybe you tap into new talent pools. The fact that you can work flexibly or from anywhere might give you an opportunity to rethink your talent strategies. Culture, obviously, huge component. We actually saw teams that worked closely, really worked very frequently with one another, ended up, increasing in the bonds and the closeness and the quality of the team health. Those that worked less closely actually had the opposite. They sort of grew in distance. And so, we saw this reinforcing for the teams that were already bonding. What do we do to make sure, new entrants can still sort of embrace the culture? And then obviously efficiently, our real estate footprint might look dramatically different, and how do we embrace that or consider that? And so, last slide on parting thoughts before introducing our panelists, some things to think about as we all think about getting hybrid right. And then, would love to hear from the panelists all the things that we've missed in the research and they're hearing on the front lines. But 4 thoughts. How do we think about the moments that matter? How do we think about those return to work moments so that you create a great experience and it leads to folks embracing, the future post-COVID dynamic? Let's measure, let's evaluate, let's experiment, let's be nimble and agile because there's a lot of uncertainty right now. And how do we really embrace the change and make it a collective change? Really think about organization-wide approach to that. So again, few starter thoughts from our research, but I am more excited to hear from the panelists here. And I think I'll go ahead and introduce them and welcome them now. So let me give a quick bio and background on each of our panelists, and then have a few questions we'll queue up for them. So first, Paul Reddick. Paul is responsible for strategy, business, and product development at Crown Castle, including pursuing new business opportunities that leverage emerging technologies like 5G, CBRS neural host radios, IoT, drones, developments in the cutting edge computing. So Paul, you're gonna have to tell me about what some of those are and how they might apply in innovation. So really excited to learn. Paul also led business development at Google before Crown Castle and was the chairman and CEO of Handmark, which led strategy, business development, and product for Sprint. So a lot of great experience. Paul, thanks for being with us today. Evan Regan-Levine. Evan is the Executive Vice President at JBG Smith's Investment Group. He specializes in research and strategic innovation. He's helped shape the firm's investment strategy with data and analytics, large strategic initiatives, obviously notably a core team member through the Amazon HQ2 pursuit and all the efforts happening in and around National Landing. In addition to the research and strategy, he co-heads the Smart City Initiative and oversees some of the partnerships bringing innovative technology, 5G, CBRS, data centers, fiber rollouts, and technology for the built environment. And prior to JBG companies and JBG Smith, Evan worked in Monday Properties and JLL and research. So Evan, really great to have you with us. Thanks for joining. Chris Camarra. is the real estate attorney in the DC office of Holland and Knight, and serves as the chairman for the firm's real estate and hospitality industry sector group. He also serves as the public and charitable services partner for the DC office and concentrates his practice in commercial real estate law, including acquisition, development, disposition, leasing, management, and finance. He represents institutional investors like life insurance company, pension funds. He also represents acquisition, financing of office buildings, shopping centers, hotels, across the suite of asset classes and property types. So, Chris, really excited to get your insights on what you're hearing across tenants and owners in each of these asset classes. So thanks, panelists. Wonderful to have you. Thanks for joining us. So I think I'll start, Evan, with you, because I know you have a really unique perspective and insight across your portfolio, existing tenants, new tenants. Maybe to help kick things off, can you give us a little overview on the state of play in commercial real estate today? And maybe help tell the story a little bit about how the region's evolved, what you saw in the early days of the pandemic. Where are we now? What indicators are you looking at to judge progress? And what are you hearing from some of the companies and tenants that you're talking to and that you have in your portfolio?
Thanks so much, Ben. I think when we start looking at this, and JBG spent a lot of time, like everyone else in our business, really trying to understand what the impact of the pandemic was going to look like and even what it is today. And I'd say that it's still a very murky picture. And I know that's not what anyone really wants to hear, but I think as we look at some of the key indicators, we really come back to a lot of the content, actually, Ben, that you covered in your presentation, because I think a lot of that is ultimately the deciding factor. So, if we look across the market, just starting at a very high level, one of the biggest disparities that, day one, if you pop up any research from any brokerage firm, you look at the amount of negative net absorption recorded even through just this year. And right now, JLL has it at just over 5.8 million feet of negative net absorption, so space given back to the market. And typically, there's a really strong relationship between job growth and employment performance and absorption. And that relationship is flexed over the years. It used to be, you could reliably count on 250 square feet of absorption positively per job added into the market. And what you saw really during the period from the great financial crisis through pre-pandemic was that there was a right-sizing effect. And that really took place, especially sort of in the mid-2010s, where you saw that ratio compress. And it went from 250 down to 200, or even down lower than that. We saw that continue just as people changed the way they used space. So utilization was the deciding factor. We had very strong job growth during that period, translated into great multifamily demand, but not great office demand. And you saw that happen against a backdrop of overbuilding in our market, or arguably under demolition of office buildings. And so that created, going into the pandemic, an environment that already wasn't particularly balanced, although there were pockets of really strong office demand. And what you've seen during the pandemic is that ratio has been upended again. And if you look at that number that I mentioned from JLL, that 5.8 million feet, that doesn't foot at all to what we're seeing in the employment perspective, in office using jobs. And you've seen, well, we haven't recovered to pre-pandemic levels. The negative absorption implied by the job losses is actually far, far lower, which means that there's something else happening here. And I think that's where you go in a layer deeper and peel back the onion. And I think the first thing you look at is what's the composition of that absorption, what's happening in that space. And when we look at the actual transaction activity that underlies those numbers, what you're seeing is that the vast majority of the negative absorption is actually coming from small tenants. Now, that actually shouldn't come as a shock to anyone on the phone who knows the commercial real estate market in DC, where the vast majority of our activity is in the small tenant space. The fact that that's the majority of the activity shouldn't surprise anyone. What it does mean, though, is that there are a number of companies, for smaller companies, who've decided during the pandemic to totally shed their space. And that follows a logical trend. It's a lot easier for small companies to say, look, I'm going to give my space back, send my workforce home, and then I'll re-enter the market later. And that's driven, we think, a lot of outsized negative net absorption. What you haven't seen is larger companies make definitive decisions around their give back of their space, not in any way that indicates a meaningful pattern or trend. And so when we look at it today, we say, okay, well, if I'm going to forecast go forward, I've got to really think about a number of different factors. One of them is how quickly do those small companies re-enter the market? And what do they look like when they come back? So that's going to be a determining factor. We say, okay, there's more negative absorption basically than job growth, job losses would have suggested. So if that comes back, we could kind of fill in a lot of that hole, that vacancy hole in the market. Then how do we grow? And the question is, do they come back at 80% of their prior square footage? Do they come back at 50%? What does that look like? And then for every other group, the larger companies who've typically sat on the sidelines, but who are now moving towards the hybrid work policies that you talked about, what is the implication of hybrid work on go forward space utilization? That's the other major question in my mind, because as we try and figure out, okay, fine, maybe that 5.8 million feet of absorption, negative absorption goes to 1 million feet of negative net absorption, and we grow off of there. That's a much steeper recovery trajectory. The question is then, as we grow, as we add jobs, as we come out of the pandemic, which has been by all accounts a very swift economic recovery up to this point, particularly within our region, that's where you have the questions about what does the government do and what does the private sector do? And one question I would say that's sort of, I think, been beaten to death in our sector, in our market, is this notion that the sky is falling around the government. And we are inclined to be more pessimistic about the office market in a lot of ways than some of our peers, because we do look at some of these bigger trends and we're worried about, okay, where is there demand? Where is there not demand? We've refocused some of our investment strategy as a result. But what I'd say is, I think where we're a little bit more optimistic is actually looking at what happens with the government. And that's one where, yes, there is a decision to telework. There's a decision to sort of push more government into work from home posture. But there are a couple of factors on that. One is that effectively, a lot of the agencies that actually drive our market are mission critical. And it doesn't go for everywhere, but a lot of groups cannot do their classified work from home. Even postal workers can't take passports home to go approve them. So there are functions of the government that have to be carried out in person. The second is that the federal government takes a long time to do everything. If you just look at the timeline of BRAC, that took a long time to work its way through the system as people moved into bases and owned spaces. So I think whatever we see the government do will probably take a long time and be somewhat limited to certain civilian agencies. I think that, though, does still create a sense that, yes, some of it will go away. Some of that demand will change. And if you apply that thinking to the private sector, kind of where I'll finish, my view of all this is that I think the big question hinges on what is the space utilization impact of hybrid work? And it's really a question here. I don't think hybrid work is going away. I don't think that inherent flexibility, which, by the way, the pandemic just accelerated, I don't think that inherent flexibility is going to go away from professional services business, from white collar knowledge work. I do think that what's going to happen over time is that you're going to see private sector employers start to decide, if my employees are in 3 days a week, do they need a desk every day they're in? That's the biggest. If I were to distill every single thing down to one question, it's that, because that changes that magical ratio of office demand to job growth. And that changes basically from the perspective of a real estate investment. How quickly can that space fill? Can it fill? And can the market get to a threshold of vacancy on the lower side where you can actually see rent growth? And just for historic context, right now, some of the brokerage firms typically put us between 18 and 20% vacant across the metro market. You need to be in the low teens to see rent growth. So really, a lot of our future of our market will depend on the attitude of larger companies towards a hybrid work policy.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Evan. Would love to come back to what does that then might mean for what space needs to look like, and some of the changes that embrace that change. Maybe Chris, would love to get your take. And I know you wear two hats here, right? One is talking to clients and hearing about their preferences, but also the decisions you're making running a large legal office, which is probably representative for a lot of professional services companies. We had a planned a grand welcome back to the office in Labor Day, I think, like many, that got pushed back. But would love to hear, when do you expect companies like yours to return to the office? What will that look like? What are you hearing from clients and seeing in some of the deals you're working on around the expectation on using space, and maybe some early insight in Evan's question around, hey, what do we think that might mean for utilization and space needs for companies if they embrace remote work in a certain share of the amount of time?
Sure. Thanks, Ben. So yeah, I'll start with just some little insight into what we're doing at our firm. So yeah, as you noted, we had like many of the professional services firms, and I think most of the large corporations in America had sort of been planning towards a Labor Day return to work. That's what we had established in the spring. And then as the Delta variant sort of took hold, we pushed that date back to October. And the October 12th was the last date. And then as of 2 weeks ago now, we are pushed out probably at least until January. We don't actually have a firm return to work date established yet. We have a committee that is evaluating the situation and will make some determination here in the next couple of months on when that'll happen. I do think, barring some new Delta or sort of new COVID variant, that the current rate of vaccinations and sort of assuming we've peaked now with the Delta variant, that Holland and Knight and most professional services firms in corporate America will be returning to work in Q1 of 22. I think that's sort of what I'm hearing internally, and then what I'm kind of hearing anecdotally from clients and others in the community. So, I think that's what we're looking for. When that happens in Q1, who knows? Early, late, TBD. What that will look like when we actually get back in the office, I think, as Evan pointed out, it's murky. I don't know. I mean, we're obviously looking at different models, looking at our existing footprint across the firm. I think even pre-COVID, at least for law firms and a lot of professional services firms, and I think Evan noted this, is there was sort of already a trend to sort of right sizing the footprint. I mean, the idea of large partner offices and smaller associate offices and cubicles for staff, that model had already started to shift away. So the footprint for a law firm was already shrinking anyway, and we had sort of the more of an egalitarian office setup in our offices. Maybe the next evolution of that may be something even more like office sharing, and even in, at least in the legal services space, that's a concept that was already in play in Manhattan. I mean, I think that was probably the only market where really saw that, but even pre-pandemic, that was a common trait of office use for the legal market, where associates would be sharing offices at least for the first few years. That we know that model can work, and so I anticipate that that'll be something that's explored more by our committee, and we'll see how that manifests itself going, in 2022. Obviously, surrounding that, obviously, is developments in prop tech and advances in that space will help make that kind of office sharing dynamic more feasible and more efficient and more user friendly. And so, and I'm sure Paul may have some thoughts on that. As far as the competition that you had noted in your slide, which I thought your research was really interesting. I guess the struggle between what the C-suite execs are looking for and what the employees are looking for. I think, at least as it relates to the urban, to our major metropolitan centers, I definitely think hybrid is the future. I think some form of that is just going to be the direction we're going. I do not see a 5 day a week, or return to work 5 days a week, or return to the office 5 days a week, excuse me. And I think a lot of the struggle there, and certainly in the larger urban centers, is accessibility to the office space. I don't think there's a sense that, at least I don't get the sense from our own, our associates and staff, or just folks that I represent or speak to in our community, that they don't like going to the office. I mean, people generally like the office. I mean, it's nice to go into the office. It's there's a lot of benefits to being in the office and having FaceTime, in-person FaceTime with other folks in the office. I think it's important for, at least in my business, for mentoring opportunities. You want to have FaceTime with your associates and be in the office with them. I think where I hear that getting the employees back into the office on a more regular basis is really getting into the downtown core. I mean, the DC already struggled with having one of the highest average commuting times of any major metropolitan area. I think the average commute pre-pandemic 2019 was like 35 minutes for DC. I think it was only, New York might have been the only metropolitan area that had a longer average commute time. And that's average. And then so, on top of that, 20% of the workforce had a commute time of more than 60 minutes. These are each way. So you look at a worker now that's been working from home for the last 18 months. They used to have 2 hours every day added to their workday. And if they're a full-time, low-wage earner, what's the incentive for them to go back in and start that commute again? I mean, so I don't know how you solve for that, but it's not just having nice amenities in your office. They're not going to, all right, I'll commute 2 hours because you've got a nice gym and a great deli. I think they're going to, it's going to have to be something else. I don't know what that is, but I think that's going to be the challenge that employers are going to face if they want them back in the office.
Would love to quickly pick on that point, Chris, for you or Evan. downtown urban core, 90+% office versus other neighborhoods, and a lot of variation across the region with mix of uses, housing, live, work, play. Are you seeing certain parts of the region sort of be more resilient, or is some of that dynamic shifting? And also, how's that impacting retail and some of the other amenities you mentioned too? Opportunities you're seeing, or sort of more resilient parts of the region as we think about some of the variation that exists in some of our different neighborhoods and really sort of components of the region.
Sure thing. I can jump on that one, Ben. I think that this is just, again, the pandemic, think of it as an accelerant. And that's really how we've looked at it in so many ways of accelerating or exacerbating trends that were already underway. And one of them was towards mixed use districts. And that's something, we've been evangelizing for years. And if you look, at a couple different neighborhoods, one of the things that's so fascinating is early in the pandemic, everyone said, this is the end of the city. This is the beginning of the suburban renaissance. Office parks are back. And no, that's nonsense. Like, that's not happening. It's not about the office park. What it is about is mixed use, urban light environments. And I think that's an area where it's not the downtown core, but it is markets like the Ballpark in DC, it's markets like the Wharf. And you started to see, look, those were markets that for a long time really only drove residential interest. There was office, largely driven by the federal government, but you've seen even major law firm moves to the Wharf, and other groups opening up from a professional services perspective or lobbying perspective in places like the Ballpark. These are neighborhoods that have come into their own. And really one of the barometers of that isn't just the fact that the vast majority of the negative absorption that we talked about before, the massive vast majority came in the urban core. And it was in the CBD and the East End. Those were big drivers within DC, where you saw very, very little happen in those emerging markets and those really interesting mixed use districts. And even if you look right outside the city, if you look at Bethesda, if you look at Reston Town Center, if you look even, shameless plug here at National Landing, those are markets that all saw, I think, a lot of renewed interest during the pandemic, and they all survived a lot better in terms of the retail activity. And if you go, still take a walk down in the CBD, go on K Street, like that doesn't feel good, because during the pandemic, when people were working from their homes, you needed apartment density to support retail. And a lot of neighborhoods, you saw coffee shops close, you saw restaurants shut down, you saw entertainment venues shuttered. That didn't happen to the same extent in neighborhoods where they had an embedded residential population. And I spent most of the pandemic on Capitol Hill and got to watch actually lines form outside of my neighborhood coffee shop at the time, which I had never seen before, like they were downtown, because everyone would come down at the beginning of their workday. And I think that's where you see the resilience of these mixed use urban environments that have, the residential to support the retail that they also do. And it is important to say this, they're not just bedroom communities. They do have an office concentration. And I think that just becomes more and more the future, especially, I'll add this, when you look at the fact that the CBD office market compared to places like the Ballpark and the Wharf, there's a $20 a foot rent difference between those markets. And so how do you justify that in an era where people are more concerned about reducing commuting times, creating amenity-rich environments? And by the way, I think Chris made a great point. You don't do that with a deli in the building. No office amenity is ever going to be enough. In that case, it's really about neighborhood serving amenities, and it's about building the places that people want to spend time and where they want to live to shorten that commute. And I think that's going to be really the hallmark of post-pandemic growth.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks, Evan. Want to shift gears a little bit, and actually, Paul, we'd love to start with you and talk a bit about some of this disruption at play, and maybe two types: technology and how that's needed and sort of going to help underpin this way we've worked in the future, but also sustainability. We see a lot of government regulation changes, potential investments, demand from tenants. We know the future of commercial real estate is likely going to be significantly greener, retrofits and new development. So maybe you talk a little bit about what role you think technology is going to play, both from sort of embracing this future that might be more hybrid, but also, hopefully is going to be greener and more competitive. What innovations are you seeing owners and occupants take?
Yeah, so there's a lot to cover there, but I want to start just by commenting on some of the conversation Evan and Chris have led, because it's very intriguing. I think last thing I'm going to do is forecast what commercial real estate is going to do, especially in DC, especially with this group on. But I would say that we're also a real estate company. Crown Castle is more tech focused. So we're a REIT that focuses on towers and small cells and fiber. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing on the property tech side for in-building as well. But as a REIT and a last owner of assets, we take a long-term view. And I think one of the things to separate out from the pandemic is the difference between what are the short-term disruptions and what's the long-term view. And I think we're generally more bullish in the long term. Even if I look from my shoes for commercial real estate, I think some of the changes that have happened are not going to dial all the way back. So I think the capacity utilization conversation is fascinating. And I think Evan was quoting the numbers of 250 square feet down to 200. I think some of that may not come back, but it's still, you can still be bullish about where things are headed because people still want to congregate. They want to congregate because they want to collaborate and be productive, or they want to socialize. And those constants are not going to go away. And so as you see job growth and economic recovery, we're betting that that office space, even though there may be a shift out a little bit, there'll be plenty of utilization and plenty of capacity that'll be filled up. But the other thing about it, in terms of when people get into the office, they're trying to be productive. That's always been the case. They've always wanted to be safe, but now more than ever. I think the fact that you want to be green and want to be sustainable has also been something that's been a growing trend well before the pandemic. And the other thing I would say is that they also want to be inclusive. Given that you're going to have people that are going to be hybrid, some people in the office, some out. We've already had broader inclusivity issues, but now you have to complicate that with the fact that some people are away from the office and some people are in the office. So now I kind of skip down to kind of the property technology and where some of that can help. The first thing is we noticed that there's just a massive increase in demand for broadband, and that's at home, and it will be in the office as well. And it actually becomes duplicative in a way. People want to have it both at home and in the office, so that you can make this hybrid work really function. And I think the other thing in terms of when people come back to the office, there's going to be a much bigger demand for flexibility and how you reconfigure office space and what you do with it. For that, I would just point to wireless technology generally is very helpful when you're wanting to kind of move things around without having to rewire. So that's a big component. We have some experience recently. We've publicized what we've done with Reagan in Manhattan, but you look at stuff that was happening again before the pandemic. There are companies that were very progressive on the use of IoT in their buildings to manage energy, and we've seen it from Reagan, from awards they've won and claims they have, and from the Empire State Building, for example, cuts in energy by 40%. So that's a big piece, and that's a big use of technology. The other thing that we're seeing is a lot of interest in occupancy and understanding when people are in and how many people are in an office. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. A lot of it initially had to do with knowing when to turn on heating and cooling and when to turn stuff off and where in the building. But increasingly, as we get into the pandemic, still fighting our way through the pandemic, people want to understand, distancing and occupancy. How many people do I have in? So that technology will help for that as well. And so we see a number of reasons that office space is going to come back. It's not going to go away. These places are not going to turn into the pyramids. They're going to be used. They're going to be retooled though. And we see a strong use of tech in that comeback.
And Paul, I'm not going to ask you for too clear of a crystal ball, but maybe one of the big looming another murky uncertainty is what's going to happen at the federal level, an infrastructure bill, and some of the potential investments in EV infrastructure, green technology, or building retrofits. Anything you're sort of tracking or seeing there? You see opportunities for the region, or more broadly, as you say, investors, occupants, developers, public-private partnerships that get you excited looking forward in the future?
Yeah, Robert, rule number one is I'm not going to forecast commercial real estate. Rule number two is I'm not going to forecast whether we're going to have a government shutdown and you guys in DC can get it together. But I would say that it'd be an easy bet to say that there's going to be a much larger spend on infrastructure generally. I would say sitting in the private sector, one thing you hope and pray is that it gets spent efficiently. And we do think there's a lot of opportunity for public-private partnership and collaboration and teamwork on this, because we all have some of the same goals. These goals on sustainability, on inclusivity, on being productive, on being safe. We all have the same goals. And our pitch would be that, having a smart city or doing this and spending the money efficiently a lot of it has to do with being smart about how you deploy that infrastructure, and including the tech infrastructure, including how you deploy broadband into a city, how you make it easy to permit, how you work to the good of not just one or two individual entities, but the broader base. And for us, as a real estate company, we really focus on shared infrastructure. So we're really pleased to see the infrastructure spend get discussed. We're really anxious to see how's it distributed through states and municipalities, and what do they do to make that happen. And our pitch would be focus on shared infrastructure. That's what's worked in the tower space. That's what's worked in fiber. That's what works in small cells. It's less disruptive when it's shared. It's more economic. It's greener when it's shared. And that goes for not only the physical assets, but it goes for spectrum as well. So we look for some smart spend from the federal government and from the private sector.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Maybe Evan, would love to just get your take. I know you guys have a bunch of recent announcements and decisions on commitments to sustainability, technology investments, 5G. Maybe talk a little bit about how you think about it in your portfolio, particularly national landing, and how it's helped you position what you want, and what you think new developments are going to look like. To the extent you can, take us behind the hood on what you're thinking about at JBG Smith on those two areas.
Sure thing. And I think, it's interesting. We started a lot of the conversations around this before the pandemic, because again, we thought this was something that was happening, that was going to drive, I think, the future for our business. And, Paul, a lot of the themes he brought up are absolutely behind our thinking on this. And I think the idea that the office building, and really, again, we think at a neighborhood scale, but that the neighborhoods of the future are digitally enabled is critical. And when we think about the types of groups that we want to attract to national landing, the genesis of our thinking here came really after looking, saying we've got Amazon as an anchor, we've got Virginia Tech as an anchor, and when we think about the creation of an innovation district, those are really two critical elements. So having a corporate and an educational anchor, we said, what can we do in terms of enhancing the connecting tissue between them? And historically, that's been a lot around physical placemaking, where we create and make investments around attracting, the best restaurateurs, the best entertainment venues, creating the best public spaces. That's all important, and we continue to do that. We think it's a major differentiator as part of how we're transforming national landing. However, when we look beyond that, we also say it's important that we're a digital placemaker. And that doesn't mean JBG Smith getting into, Crown Castle's business or getting into becoming a telecom company. But what it has meant is us making very strategic investments in ensuring the delivery of the right digital infrastructure to make national landing sort of competitive now, but also a little bit of a microcosm of what we think the rest of the cities in the United States are going to look like over the next decade. But we're doing that because we want to draw innovative companies in. And really, second only to talent is infrastructure and connectivity when we talk to actual decision makers at a lot of these firms. And so we made investments starting at the ground level with fiber, and many of you have seen, we in the form of a long-term lease structure, control of Arlington County's former dark fiber for the economic development purposes in national landing. We're using that to create an innovation district. We made that purchase very intentionally to accelerate the rollout of our overall redundant fiber network that we're running in a much more dense fashion to every building in the market, and creating a redundant loop that terminates in edge data centers. And we think that edge data centers are going to become a much more important feature of the urban environment, as you have a lot of low latency computing applications, as you have a need also to power the 5G future and everything that 5G unlocks from the perspective of, again, very, very high speeds, very low latency, particularly around millimeter wave 5G. And then we leverage the same scale and control, which again is a major factor here. It's very difficult for most real estate owners to basically accelerate something like a 5G rollout or do fiber, because they don't control the right of way, they don't control massive blocks and locations. But given our size and scale as a giant, master plan mixed use environment that's also happens to be an existing neighborhood, one of the benefits was we actually control a lot of the fiber pathways, we control a lot of the buildings, obviously in national landing, a lot of the future development, and that let us basically create places to put 5G radio equipment. And so we structured it in such a way where we knew that those radios would have fiber, they would have power, the fiber would terminate in our data centers. That edge data center is a place we could put a lot of equipment around the sort of deployments that we're doing. And then we said beyond that, we want to control the spectrum. And we want to control spectrum in national landing and CBRS, mostly because we want to ensure that some of it's available for innovators. And we want to hold that off of the market and not just let it be dominated by carriers, but let it be used by innovative companies, research organizations, universities, et cetera. And the rest of it, we're going to offload. And it's the whole idea that basically we made investments in this stack, and we've even modified our buildings in such a way that we can bring DAS through the buildings. And we've also pushed our carrier partners, which AT&T is the lead carrier coming into the market, to really deliver, millimeter wave 5G in our core environment, because we want to really showcase what can happen. So we've built this entire technology stack. And the thinking was we want to use it to have conversations with innovative companies who see national landing as a place where all the infrastructure is in place to do all the kinds of work they want to do in the future. And that's not just about the way they do their work, but also the way they showcase their innovations. And that's one thing that's unique, again, in this DC conversation, is that Washington, obviously, regulation and and public policy is becoming vastly important for technology and high growth companies. And the ability to have something in the backyard of Washington, the backyard of the regulators, the backyard of lawmakers and policymakers, where people can come and show, hey, this is what this technology does. This is why it matters. It's much less abstract. And when you ask people, what is 5G? Why does it matter? Well, showing something like 5G, in play, in practice, along with some of the sort of social elements of, bridging the digital divide or creating an innovation ecosystem and environment, showing that in person is important. And we think that's driving a lot of activity. So we have really repositioned this, not just to make it easier for people to work from home or work from their apartments, but really to drive really innovative use cases with partner companies that can transform what it means to be part of a neighborhood and office environment. And one of the examples I give is, think about AT&T's Discovery District. It's really, astonishing. They're starting to deploy a lot of their technologies in public, in a public place, and show what can it do and bring different innovative use cases to say, this is what can happen here if you have the right infrastructure. So that finally ties in, I'll just comment quickly on sustainability, is, as we think about what does that future look like, it's not only more connected, it's not only more amenitized, it's also more sustainable. And that's what's behind, our recent move towards carbon neutrality. It's behind a lot of the announcements that we've made, where we really say that, look, a lot of our sustainability, future is actually enabled and enhanced by the technology investments. So when we think about things like curb management, if we think about sensorizing everything, we own our own spectrum, we have massive amounts of fiber, we have 5G in the market, we can literally deploy the most advanced sensor network possible, and we can do it in a way that serves as a sustainability goal. And so for us, it's very important that we make these investments now, because we think, look, this is the environment, again, connected, amenitized, and sustainable, that's going to be an outsized performer as we look at kind of future growth from the high-tech companies who are driving the growth in our region. It is not just about the federal government anymore. It really is about that kind of growth.
I want to cue off of one thing that Evan said that I think is really clever that they're doing at the national landing is, we talk about public-private partnerships and government sector working with private sector. There's another public-private definition here, which is really having what you call public networks, the big carriers. You want to have great coverage from the big carriers, and tenants and residents are going to demand that. But the idea that they're also opening up private network possibilities, so that the building owner themselves can run their own private network, but some of those enterprises within the building can run their private network and can have access to 5G and the ability to break out data and do what they want. We think that's a trend that's really going to continue. And we'd also say kind of local edge compute towards that. I'm sure the team's working with data center companies and others to make that happen. Those things are going to be really, really clever. And I think when Ben, you kind of kicked off, you might have said neural network, but it's really neutral host networks. We're not getting that far out on the limb, but we think of neutral host networks as being ones where the public network can use it. It could be AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile can use it, but that private networks can be run off that as well. So that's kind of our definition of neutral host networks. And I hear that sounds a little bit like what Evan's doing with the CBRS spectrum and the PALs that JBG Smith has bought. So that's great.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here too, real quick, if you don't mind, Ben. I was just, and I don't want to pile on Evan here, but I think what Evan just described. I mean, JBG's created this really fabulous ecosystem, and their plans are really exciting. And you talk about that in the context of this. We brought this up in the live, work, play environment, and we think maybe that's the future, right? I think we're one of the, and I sort of throw this to Evan, I guess, because I think JBG is one of the market leaders in this space, is, the affordability issue. And so, I think these, like I said, I think these ecosystems are fantastic, and I think they're really exciting, and I think a lot of folks want to participate in them. Demand for housing down on the wharf, as an example. I think, there's, as Evan noted, there's been a relocation there of some major law firms and other corporate entities that are now down on the wharf. And it's fantastic for I think the C-suite and higher wage earners to actually participate in the live, work, play dynamic. In other words, they've solved the live part because they can afford to be there. And so I think the question becomes, how do we solve that for the lower income workers and sort of the missing middle? And I know, like I said, I know JBG's been trying to solve this, been working with the DC government on this. And I think that's another aspect of sort of the public-private partnership. Because I don't think the private sector can solve that alone. They need support from the public sector. And I think to date, the public sector has not done a great job of of solving that problem, but I think they're getting better. I know there's some new inclusionary zoning requirements now in DC. They may have a meaningful impact, but that's not going to solve the problem on its own. And so, not to steal your thunder, Ben, as moderator here, but I was just curious what, if Evan had any thoughts on that and what they're doing, because like I said, I know that they're in this space.
No, I think it's massively important. And one of the lessons learned, I think, from looking at growth, we study tech growth in a lot of different cities across the country. And one of the things we've seen consistently is that, where that works and where it's more sustainable is in places where it doesn't destroy the overall sort of urban fabric. And I use that, it sounds like really dramatic language, but I think one of the challenges is that, and I know it's been called a prosperity bond in many cases. And when we look at national landings, long-term sustainability from just a growth perspective, it's important that there's, that it's accessible in more ways than one. And I think that's what's led us, from the perspective of standing up the Washington Housing Initiative and really sort of creating a new model for buying and preserving existing market rate affordable units, because I think one of the things that get lost in the conversation a lot is, we do a great job of serving the high end of the market and a decent but not good enough job of serving the lowest end of the market. What we don't do is really service sort of the workforce affordable housing. So when you think about everyone who makes all this amazing technology work and services it, when you think about teachers, firefighters, police officers, people in that space have been, dramatically pushed out of what were otherwise very affordable housing units. And there's two ways to fix that. One, and you have to do them in concert. One is to build market rate housing. Like, I can't tell you how ridiculous it is every time I hear someone say, well, the way to stop, gentrification or, affordable housing, destruction is to stop all construction. Well, if you're not stopping job growth, you're just restricting supply, and supply and demand are going to do what they've done forever in eternity and price people out of the market of existing product, no matter how old that product is. So you need to really do two things. You need to build more product and more supply if you have job growth, so you can accommodate those high wage earners moving into a market, especially in a technology context. And you have to preserve existing affordable housing and make sure that that's done at scale. We're not talking 20 units or 50 units, talking about thousands of units, and doing that in a way that, that makes sense, it's economically sustainable, because you have to preserve that housing. Otherwise, you end up with a place where companies eventually can't afford to grow. And it starts, at a lower level, and it's just, say, the bottom tier of people is pushed out of a market. But then you say, well, it actually expands to the point where it's actually even impacting the companies themselves who are driving the growth with their more entry-level employees. And you've seen that happen in California.
And I would say not only does the housing have to be affordable, but they need to be broadband connected. So the digital divide problem is another major piece, and I think you guys are hitting some of that as well. And that's one where we would really pitch on the I said neutral host, but just shared infrastructure generally, because it's really hard on the private side for some companies to make the investment, so they haven't filled the gap because they're trying to make it on their own and build their own proprietary infrastructure. But if you build shared infrastructure, you can make that far more affordable. So that's just one thing to factor in as you're developing these new spaces.
I think this is a great segue. And we got a couple of questions in the Q&A, and maybe good time to invite others in the Q&A to send questions in, make sure we get a chance to answer some of them. But so one of the questions that you guys have all touched on is how to think about the role of public and private sector, potential partnerships, talked about affordable housing, digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, with a participant group that's probably a mix of leaders across public and private sector. What are some of the things that you've seen that can be done to support these pandemic related changes and innovations that you think could be exciting to try to embrace, that innovation and how we're going to think about the future of commercial space and otherwise?
I mean, one example I'd use right off the bat is what we just did with Arlington. And I think that, we had an unbelievable partnership there to still do with them around fiber, because Arlington is very forward thinking. And, Jack Belcher over there deserves a lot of credit for really leading their, their innovation and technology group to think creatively about the future. And their investment in fiber was something that I think was forward looking. And so we looked at them and said, now that, because you've made this investment, we want to partner with you. We want to invest further in the pathways and the conduit, stuff that's irreplaceable. And we think that we can use that to then unlock all these other use cases that sit on top of it, because we want to create an innovation district to drive economic development out of the pandemic. That's the same goal that Arlington had. And so we've come together, public and private, to say we want to make National Landing an innovation district, and we want to use this fiber to really drive all sorts of other, again, things, even to Paul's point about addressing the digital divide, or about creating, again, a place where, Virginia Tech, and especially around their diverse STEM programs, could really sort of say, look, we have all the infrastructure we need to do something special. So you've seen that commitment there. And I think that's just one example of how we can make kind of hard asset joint ventures, if for lack of a better term, even it's not really a JV, like to go drive an innovation outcome that, is important post-pandemic.
Just hit a couple points. I mean, one, not to be too negative on it, but I think I've seen a lot more failed attempts than I've seen really successful attempts. And we've all been involved in a lot of conversations where there's multiple parties, within a municipality, for example, the police department, school districts, others, but to be able to get to coordinate and really make that happen, that's a really, really difficult thing to make happen. But I would say we've done some things with school districts that we find interesting. Distance learning is one of those things that's really accelerated during the pandemic, and it won't go all the way back. The other thing, we look at some of the administration's push on EV, and we look at EV charging stations and the ability to do things like deploy small cells within EV charging stations and work with people on those rollouts. Those are things when you're thinking about sharing and being really efficient. Those are some of the smarter things that we've seen. I think there's a ton of opportunity here. So I'm not trying to be negative but I'm just saying, from somebody outside the Beltway, when you get in to work on these, you're really providing shared infrastructure with multiple beneficiaries, and coordinating and not having the free rider problem is a big one to tackle.
Yep. So another question here. We've talked a lot. I mean, one of the key words for, I think, this session has been an accelerant, right? The pandemic's been an accelerant. And so maybe you could talk about what kind of innovative ideas in terms of the future of space and physical space might be getting introduced more frequently when we think about accelerating what the future of an office and mixed use space is going to look like.
Sure. I think, one of the biggest ones that I've seen is really the push towards, outdoor accessibility and access. And I know this gets a lot of press, but look, I mean, the idea of this office building, that sits in the middle of a field and is hermetically sealed against everything, that doesn't work anymore. And nor does it work to be in a claustrophobic downtown office tower. And I think what you've seen is a move towards more, outdoor space and outdoor access from a wellness perspective in office buildings. I think you've seen also a realization that office doesn't have to just be in a business district. And we talked about this before. So the rise of office in amenity-rich environments. And by the way, the office having amenities that look more like an apartment building or multifamily building and having more than be outdoors, I think that's one big innovation on the office side, that it's forced people to break out of their box of what an office looks like. And also in terms of physical configuration, what I've seen to date, when we look at, tenant space plans and how people are thinking about adapting their space, even if they're not shrinking their footprint, I think what they're doing is they're reconfiguring their footprint. And one of the ways they're doing that is it's not about creating a space for you to do work. That's, at the end of the day, for knowledge workers, that's not why you come to the office. You come to the office to collaborate, to work with coworkers. If you literally come every day to sit at a desk and you don't talk to anyone, then you can easily work from home. And that, at the end of the day, is not why, when you talk, when Chris talks about people wanting to come back to the office, people want to come back to the office to collaborate, to work together. And I think you've seen companies reconfigure their space away from just the provision of sort of, grand shrines to sitting at your desk, to instead being places that are more like a college campus, where you have more gathering areas, more public seating areas, not just, in terms of the outdoor space, but being able to do that inside the space. That's changing, and you're seeing offices continue to get smaller and work areas continue to shrink, because instead it's more important that you have better conference facilities, better meeting spaces, better ad hoc places. It's not just, okay, go into the 15-person conference room and sit down and go through the PowerPoint slides. It's, let's go sit, in a comfy chair by the coffee machine and talk about, our project and map something out. That's really where you're seeing the advances on the office side.
I'm gonna invoke rule number 3. I'm not gonna predict office configuration, open office, all that kind of stuff. But one thing I will say is I think that the idea that you need to be flexible. You need to be able to configure, refigure, and you might try to, we might try to learn something from some of the companies that have served more the startup community in Silicon Valley and other places where things are moving and changing all the time. People grow from 10 people to 100 people, and they cut back to 5 people, and then a new company moves in, and they've got to be able to dial in and dial out real quick. There's some things to learn from that. And I think it's not just flexible for the worker during the day, but it's flexible for the tenant to reconfigure on the fly. And that's one where I think there's a lot to that, but property tech can help on that piece as well.
Awesome. All right, maybe last question. Would love for each of you. So I'm going to ask for your crystal ball one more time, maybe, Paul, maybe if it forced the rule. But when you look ahead to the future of our region, what makes you optimistic when it comes to commercial real estate? What do you think we need to do to get there?
Well, first off, again, coming from outside the Beltway, I'd say if there's an area that I wouldn't expect to see a lot of insecurity coming from, it would be DC, because you have some of the most stable employment, a massive economy just in running the federal government alone that isn't going to go away. So from that perspective, I also see that that the dynamic, and there were some articles in the Wall Street Journal yesterday on DC real estate, but there are some really positive dynamics and really creative minds, some of them on this call on real estate. So I believe, again, these places are not going to turn into pyramids. Places are going to get retooled. There's going to be a significant amount of office space utilization, even though the actual per person may go down. And again, some of it's going to get back to the fundamentals on what's driving the economy, what's driving employment, those types of things. I also like seeing the idea that you've drawn in a lot of people into DC. I think the gentrification issue comes up, but I do think DC has a promise of having a great, mixed use, not just office space, but mixed use. So maybe if the residents are moving away from the office space, get the residents back in, get that mix back in, and from there, I'm positive, long-term positive.
I'd say, from where I sit, it's funny. I remember hearing some of the same, sky is falling conversations in the financial crisis. And when we look at DC, what's changed since then? Well, we've seen the emergence of places like 14th Street, Shaw, Union Market, Noma, H Street, the Ballpark, the Wharf. None of these places existed on the map as they exist now. And I think you saw a massive change where we looked and said, oh my God, the world is ending. What's going to happen to commercial real estate? It changed. It changed the way it looked. It changed what drove everything. But it also created some unbelievable new environments, and it forced people to adapt and improve the breed. And I think that for all the terrible negatives of COVID and just the pandemic life and everything that we've seen happen outside of that, I think one of the great positives is it forces reimagination. And that's what created those neighborhoods in the past. It's as, real destinations with, reinvestment and economic growth. And no, they're not perfect in the way they were executed, but nothing is. And I think we're going to see that drive, to Paul's point, a retooling, a rethinking, and ultimately, I hope something that comes out of this is a more humane approach to the way people work and collaborate and live. And that's really driven for the first time, and you've seen this in Ben's slides, by actually the desires of the people who come into work. And with talent is the most important feature, how do you really meet the needs of the people who drive your business? At the end of the day, that creates a more human-centric environment for everyone. So that's what I'm optimistic about.
Yeah, and I would just echo what Paul and Evan said. I mean, I think what's going to solve, and why I'm optimistic, is I think there's just a lot of really smart, creative people in the CRE space, and as Evan pointed out, they've risen to the occasion before. I'm old enough, so I've heard this even pre-financial crisis, back to 2001, when it was the death knell for cities was being sounded, and everyone was going to be fleeing Manhattan, never return. So yeah, I am optimistic. I think, but I do think there's some challenges that we've all talked about. But I'm very confident that that the industry is prepared to solve those challenges. So I think it's all good.
Awesome. Well, Evan, Paul, Chris, thanks. Been awesome to be with you. I think I'll turn it back over to George, but just want to say thanks. Expected to be super insightful discussion. Really appreciate and learned a ton. And George, cue it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. Really appreciate it. Once more, we want to thank Crown Castle and Verizon, our series sponsors, and our knowledge partners, McKinsey and Company. Thank you, Ben. And APCO worldwide. Additionally, I wanted to say so much appreciation for Chris, Paul, and Evan. Thank you for taking the time to talk with us today and for sharing all that great information and perspective. We really appreciate it. This has been a very informative discussion. We appreciate the insights, and today's briefing will be available because there's been some questions on the website later this week. Stay well, everyone, and have a really fantastic day, and we look forward to the next event. Thank you.
Thanks, George.